question for Studio Gang. I'm Vicente Montes with CDC. We are working on your Wanda Vista project, and we also work at the Aqua Tower. The question is about your solar carving technique. Do you take only the consideration of direct sunlight to shape the buildings, or do you also take into account light reflected off the facade to shape additional features of the projects?
No. Thanks for your question. In the solar carved tower in New York, we really were looking at two things. One was the solar angles of how the building, how the light would incident the High Line itself, and also views from the High Line. So we felt that that was really an important thing. So we're working with Arup. It was really interesting to propose several variations of those cuts in the building, and the building still had to be structural and hold up for all of those potential outcomes. And so we ended up going with a concrete structure, but in general, I think to your question, the main focus, I guess, was solar angles to get to the gardens of the High Line in that case, because we were able to provide over 200 more hours of daylight to the gardens. So not on our own site, but literally this interior block park. We weren't really shaping it to respond to reflected light, because that's something that changes very quickly throughout the day, but really focused on the planted material and the human experience along the High Line for views. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Milan from Mumbai. Jeanne, your work is truly inspiring. Tom, my questions to you. It was amazing the way you've been able to reduce the cost on the steel and other aspects. Could you share on any two projects that you've done, what was the actual consumption of steel per square meter and what was the cost of construction?
So the cost of construction on those projects is pretty tightly guarded, to the extent that I don't have the final numbers myself. I think in terms of the total tonnage, I think on most of the towers we're talking around the sort of 100 kilograms a meter squared. Many of the towers, it's worth mentioning, that we presented don't have concrete cores, and so I think it's important when you do assess the true cost of a building that you have to take into account the concrete and the steel as well. But we've certainly found in Mexico City, where the earthquake demands are very large, reducing the amount of concrete in the building can pay dividends, because it reduces the forces that you have to design to. So there's been a big driver for steel on that front.
Rafael Oliveira with Thornton Tomasetti, and I represent CTBUH in São Paulo, Brazil. On the concept of the exospatial aspect, was privacy ever an issue that was raised? In a more broader sense to the rest of the panel, do you think we as a society are becoming less concerned about privacy, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? There's an author called Peter Diamandis who thinks that privacy is not that important. We're becoming more open. We have our roads are mapped. There are thoughts of mapping interiors as well of public places. Do you think privacy is becoming less important, and is that good or bad?
Right. I think that you hit on a really important part, because in thinking about our buildings going forward, especially residential buildings, there's a new attitude about privacy. I think when we first started designing the Aqua Tower, there was our client really thought maybe we should have partitions between these balconies so people have total privacy in their own space. But we really argued against that, because a lot of times the only contact you have with your neighbors is the ride on the elevator, which is very awkward, down to the base of the building. And we thought, even if you don't have a conversation across the balcony, it's nice to have these oblique views and acknowledge that there's a community living within this. I think the result was really exciting, that the developers, Magellan, allowed us to and believed in this, as well as the idea that the amenities between the hotel, the apartment, and the condo would all be shared amenities. So not like private condo facilities, apartment facilities, and hotel, but one united group of social spaces that everybody could use. And the results are incredible. I think the building, Gary mentioned the success of the building that he recently completed. And with the Aqua Tower in Chicago, it was completed really on a fraction of the budget of, let's say, the Trump Tower that was built about the same time. But in Chicago, the second sales of the residential units, it's the second highest price per square foot of any building in the city for residential. And I really think it does have to do with an idea of social connectivity that's desired for young and old people, because we now are we want that connection, especially in our cities. So I'd be interested also to hear what other people think.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. We're seeing, so there's a difference between privacy and social connectivity. We're seeing, like, privacy is personal, but I think there is an enhanced desire for social connectivity, and these buildings can be facilitators to them. We're actually seeing the shift. I showed you that amenity deck up there. So we're actually seeing a shift away from people thinking about these as individualized spaces and really as containers for experiences, and really about mechanisms for building those types of communities within a building rather than just creating a marketing advantage. So we're seeing, people really paying attention to what people do in those spaces rather than having a list, of those spaces. In terms of privacy issues, you guys can take a walk down to the High Line and go to the Standard Hotel, and if you're lucky, you might see somebody having sex in a window. So that, so there are, so people, there are. Some people are shy and some people are not so shy, but I think everyone has a desire for connection.
And on the exospatial piece, just that the idea that, yes, everyone needs privacy too, but maybe the threshold space, like when you step outside your unit, is a very appropriate space to have this kind of visual connection. So, you might be able to have sex in your room in the Standard Hotel, but if you went out onto the balcony, you're kind of part of this outdoor exospatial community.
I think there's another dimension. Buildings are changing from spaces that people inhabit. I mean, they still are inhabited by people, but I think you can also think about them as giant pieces of hardware. And the computer industry is relatively well developed in terms of understanding the implications of that. I don't think the building industry is quite there yet, and so the implications for the uses of that hardware, I think, are to be determined, and privacy is a huge component of that.
Yeah, I think it would be great to connect with Tom on the idea of, because you talked about minimizing structure at the base of the building, and in your building you inherited gigantic structure at the base. And Tom, you've been talking about minimizing that. So I'm curious if anyone else is looking at that minimization of structure at the base to use for literal public passing through the building, or is it mainly, are you seeing in your work that the developers are trying to just maximize the ground floor for rentable space?
So I think on BBVA is a good example of that, where the ground floor is publicly accessible. It's a bank branch. The building's for a bank, and so they've taken that opportunity, I think, of the visual connection afforded by the lack of structure to invite people into the building. So we are seeing it. We've done a lot of work in Asia with similar attempts to create these sort of villages that many people have talked about. So I think it creates flexibility, and the use of that will then be determined by the client and collaborators such as yourselves. But I think it does create a lot of excitement and potential.
So we're actually looking at several. We've just completed our first residential diagrid here in the city at 170 Amsterdam. I think it's on the tour. And so basically we're amazingly excited by sort of dovetailing innovative structure into building programs that typically haven't benefited from it. And so, so we have a knock-on project that we're taking on in Crystal City outside of Washington, D.C., where the idea really is to lift up the structure, Jeanne, exactly as you suggest, in order to provide access from a street to a public park directly above in a relatively seamless fashion.
That's interesting.
Thanks. Rosemary Kennedy from Brisbane. I want to go back to that social connectivity question, and your comment was that the ride in the lift is really awkward, so we need to find other ways to create community. And so I'm thinking, are there ways that residential towers, or are you doing it already, can learn from some of the things that are happening in offices where floor to floor there's a lot more openness now between levels, whereas in a lot of residential towers it's just sort of pancake design, and really people have that journey through the building, through the lift tower. Research I've done, people really want to be able to use the stairs, and they don't. So can you say anything about that?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that. Just a project that we're currently under construction at the University of Chicago. It's actually a residence hall with 800 beds, residence hall. And in each of we were challenged by the university to try to create that social connectivity between students. They have 4 years at the university, and they need to create those bonds, and there's also benefits to having mentoring relationships between the fourth-year students and the first-year students. And so we took a structure of 100 students to create a house. So out of the 800 beds, there's 8 houses. And the length of the building was designed so that 3 floors would house 100 students. So every 3 floors in intersecting those pancake floors is a 3-level, almost like a townhouse inserted into the structure of the building with openness and stairs connecting between. So that literal house that's inserted into the 3 stories has a kitchen, it has a dining room, a living room, study areas, and the whole intention of that openness within the structure of the building is to create a very fluid and open social connection. So I think it's a great, and as I said, I think there's really a new generation of people that are going to start living in cities and demanding more connectivity, and we've been designing for, there's buildings that are designed for luxury, high-end privacy and homes, but there needs to be a whole new generation of buildings that addresses the new desires and of the next people that will be living in cities, and they want diversity, density, and social connectivity right outside their door, and maybe even within the building. So I think it's a great point that you bring up, and something that I would love to see start to be available in the market living.
Any questions? There's stuff going on in the market that which is to try to take. So you actually have to change the economic model of either sale or leasehold in order to break it. So it needs a disruptive company to basically take it on. Those disruptive companies are actually active in the market and are exploring models that would take the sort of what WeWork did to officing to WeLive, in applying that to a residential model. And so to be like a per bed per month model with sort of much more flexible living arrangements, much more fluid living arrangements. If it works, it'll be incredibly exciting and incredibly disruptive to existing economic models.
But I mean, what is the architect's role in trying to bring this model to, the city? And I think that's oftentimes, we respond to our program, and I think it would take together, working early in the process, collaboration between the architect, economist, the structural engineer, everyone that is involved in the building to really start thinking about how to deliver something like this together, and not, the traditional process where it's a program that's developed and then the architect's brought on, then the engineer. So I think it's kind of suggests a deeper collaboration that, than what we already see with necessary for tall buildings.
Can I add a couple of things to that?
Yeah.
So I think we talk a lot about the tall building as being a vertical village, and I think a key part of what you've just talked about, Jeanne, is the connection between the surrounding space, and I think maybe planning that encompasses not just the vertical village but the real village would be very, very beneficial. Flippantly, I was thinking that maybe you could also turn the question on its head, and I was wondering how you could make better use of the time in the elevator. As a kind of awkward Brit, when I moved here, I found it very uncomfortable that Americans spoke to me in the elevator. I've kind of got over that now, but I was wondering whether you could actually use it for something like an elevator pitch. I was just imagining a building which maybe has investors in, and as you go up, you've got your 60 seconds to pitch. So maybe there's another way we could look at it.
I like it.
Great. We have a question at the back.
We've gone to these sessions over the years, and the conversations are always similar in the sense that, with good reason, the architects show their masterful jobs, and the structural engineers particularly show the heroics that went into creating or participating in the creation of those projects. And we keep talking about Center City and how we're improving our ability to do these heroic events. My question to you is a little bit different. How are we using our talent, structural as well as the architectural, in terms of creating housing that could be a mix of, when you speak social, of varying income levels, such as we're trying here in New York, and I know some other cities are doing. Is there an effort to do so in Chicago? And if so, could you give us some idea?
It's a great point, because I think we're talking about mainly different levels of buildings today. Some that are rental, geared towards students, others that are geared toward the high end. But really, you put your finger on the point, which is what I think the next frontier is: how do we integrate a mixed society of different levels of income in the same building? And I honestly think that could be, that it's desirable. It is, most people don't want to live in just secluded in an ivory tower. So how do you get this, address inequity within the building footprint? And I think, the attempts in Chicago have been to require a certain amount of affordability in the tall buildings. But sometimes it has been in the past possible to kind of buy your way out of that. So we see that happening. And I think more recently in San Francisco, a project that we're working on in the city called the Folsom Project. It's a new residential tower in San Francisco. The policy was strongly in place to require a much higher level of affordability on the site. And so I guess my solution to your question is saying that there's a kind of a policy level to it that we need to probably enact first before we'll see response to that from developer and from ownership. But the exciting thing is, in San Francisco, at least, there's a huge desire for that type of residential, and we see the prices of the market rate are still continuing to rise, and rise even with a very high percentage of affordable living accommodated within the same building footprint.
So Erwin, we currently probably have 500 units of affordable housing on the boards, 300 of which are in standalone affordable buildings, through third-party developers using various federal programs, and the other 200, probably 250 are through the 80-20 program, which is a great program for integrating lower income and market rate housing together. I think the solution is to be asking the questions that you're asking, and for everyone in the room to get involved, because the public policy frame is inadequate, unstructured, and fragmented right now. And so basically it requires all of our advocacy. So basically everyone in so we lose money on almost every affordable project. We take it on because it's the right thing to do. We advocate as part of committees for basically reform to the, to the underlying regulatory frame. Everyone in the room should get involved. It's a very, very serious problem.
Thank you, Gary. If I may, I would argue with you on a premise of losing money. The city I know, certainly New York City, and I've been on the City Planning Commission for almost 20 years. We have actively taken zoning steps and zoning changes to create additional FAR, create additional opportunity to builders who will participate in a combination building or indeed possibly even build buildings off-site. You may have been reading in the newspapers just recently of two major deals that went through, Cooper's Village and Stuyvesant Town. The City of New York contributed both money. The City of New York gave them the ability to transfer air rights off-site. So zoning can be a tremendous advantage. And the reasons for my questions obviously are, as you said, Gary, I'm trying to stimulate thinking that goes beyond WL square over 8 and the facade into the ability of us in this construction community, which is a huge community and a huge value to the city, for all of us to be aware of the fact that we're not only building buildings in Midtown that are only available to millionaires and billionaires, but there are other members of our society who need our help as well.